Welcome to section 3.2. First comment, the very last section you are not responsible for, so we will stop after example number 13. Section 3.2 begins with the problems find the exact value of the expression. And this is really a thinking exercise, but we will deal with it as we go along. Number one is the secant of arcsine of negative root 3 over 2. And these are basically two-step problems. The first thing we have to do is find what is the arcsine of this. Okay, the arcsine is negative, and arcsine we know is in quadrant either 1 or 4. Since it's negative, that means it's in quadrant number 4. And so we know that the sine of this is root 3 over 2. Well, where is the sine equal to root 3 over 2? That is at pi over 3. This angle right here. So this becomes, what is the secant of, naming it appropriately, it's not positive pi over 3 because pi over 3 is in here in quadrant 1. It's negative pi over 3. Now the secant of negative pi over 3, well, we know it's already in the fourth quadrant, and it's cosine. All students take calculus, so the secant will be positive, and then all we have to do is find what is the cosine of pi over 3. Well, the cosine of pi over 3 is 1/2, but the secant is that reciprocal, and so that would be 2 over 1 or 2. Example number 2. We want the cosecant, which I know is the reciprocal of sine, times or of the arc cosine of root 3 over 2. And so I know I'm going to get the cosecant of something. So I need to determine what is the arc cosine of root 3 over 2. Okay. Arc cosine is positive, so that means it's in quadrant 1. Where is cosine equal to root 3 over 2? At pi over 6. And so this whole thing right here equals pi over 6. So the new question becomes, what is the cosecant of pi over 6? Well, cosecant I know is positive because it's in quadrant 1, and it's the inverse of sine. Well, the sine of pi over 6 is 1/2. The inverse of 1/2 is 2 over 1 or 2. Example number 3. We're asking what is the secant of the arctangent of negative root 3. So I know I'm going to eventually have to take the secant of something. But the first question is, what is the arctangent of negative root 3? Where is tangent negative? Well, tangent's negative in actually quadrants 2 and 4, but arctangent can only be in quadrant 1 or 4, so we're actually talking quadrant 4. And so we need to determine what is that angle right there. Okay, where does tangent equal root 3? That is at pi over 3. Now this angle is actually going to be called negative pi over 3. So now the question becomes secant. Okay, the reciprocal of secant is cosine. Cosine down here is positive, so we know our secant is positive, and then we need to ask ourselves, what is the cosine of pi over 3, and that is 1/2, and so we need the reciprocal of that, 2 over 1, which equals 2. Now of course, if you remembered back up here to example number 1, once we got to this point, we would immediately know the final answer is 2. Example number 4. What is the sine of arctangent of 2? Okay, First thing, arctangent being positive means it's going to be in quadrant 1. So we've dealt with that. But 2 does not appear in our table anywhere. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to draw ourselves a little triangle. And we're looking at this angle right here. I'll just call it angle alpha, which is a new Greek letter. Now, in order for tangent to be 2, that would be the opposite over the adjacent. Or 2 over 1 is another way to write it. And it doesn't take too much to realize that this would be the square root of 5, using the Pythagorean theorem. So, I've got my triangle. I know this is my angle. I know it's in the first quadrant. So everything in the first quadrant is positive. So I've dealt with that Seigen issue. Then the question becomes, what is the sine of this angle? Well, the sine of this angle is opposite over hypotenuse, or 2 over root 5. Now, of course, we don't like this, so rationalizing the denominator, we get 2 root 5 over 5. Number 5. The cotangent of the arc sine of negative 8/9. Okay, first thing. Arc sine is negative, and arc sine has to be either quadrant 1 or quadrant 4. So that means it's in quadrant 4. We know that. 8/9 doesn't show up in our table. So that means we need to draw a triangle. I'm going to look at this angle here. So if the sine is 8/9, I know that is opposite over hypotenuse. And then doing the Pythagorean theorem, we see that this would be the square root of 17 of this angle. And that's what we're really dealing with. Now we need to figure out what is the cotangent of that. Well, let's deal with the Seigen first. Cotangent here in the fourth quadrant is negative. So we know it's going to be negative something. Cotangent is the reciprocal of tangent. Tangent is opposite over adjacent. So cotangent would be adjacent over hypotenuse, or square root of 17 over 8, which does not simplify any further, and so that is the final answer for number 5. Example number 6. What is the cosine of arc sine of 4/5? Okay. First of all, we're going to determine which quadrant are we talking about. Arc sine is positive. Well, if arc sine is positive, then that means it's in the first quadrant. So, we know everything's in quadrant 1, so that means everything's positive, so we don't need to worry about the Seigen. Now we need to do some calculations here. The sine would be opposite over hypotenuse, so that would be opposite over hypotenuse. The Pythagorean triple says that that has to be the value 3, and then all I need to do is find out what is the cosine of that. The Seigen is positive. The cosine of this angle is adjacent over hypotenuse, or 3/5. Example number 7 asks what is the arc sine of the sine of 5 pi over 4. And it sure would be nice if we could just say, okay, the arc sine of the sine is equal to that. But we can't necessarily do that, because we do have to go from the innermost and go from there. So here we actually have the angle 5 pi over 4, which happens to be way over here in quadrant 3. And so we have to determine what is the sine of that. Well, the reference angle is pi over 4. The Seigen down here is negative. So this is going to become the arc sine of a negative something. Negative what? Well, the sine of pi over 4 is root 2 over 2. Now we look at this problem, and it becomes really a whole new problem, because we never, in arc functions, we never deal with quadrant 3. So since this ended up in quadrant 3, we basically have 2 separate problems within one. So Arc sine, where is it negative? Well, we either have option quadrant 1 or quadrant 4. It happens to be in quadrant 4. So now we have to find what is that angle. Well, where does sine equal root 2 over 2? That is the angle pi over 4. But we don't call this pi over 4. We call it negative pi over 4. And that is the final answer to number 7.